The quiet house felt heavy with memories. Margaret, a woman in her late 30s, sat alone at the dining table, her fingers tracing the edge of an old photograph. Her husband, Robert, smiled back at her from the frame, his face full of life and warmth. She hadn't been able to take this photo down, even though it had been months since his death. There were other photos around the room, all reminders of their happier days together, days filled with laughter and shared dreams. But now all that remained were echoes of those memories, filling the empty spaces in her home and her heart. Her grief had been overwhelming, a storm that wouldn't pass. Every day felt like a struggle, trying to find a reason to get out of bed, trying to push away the sadness that clung to her. The love she had for Robert was still so fresh, so raw. The world had seemed to stop when she lost him. He had been everything to her, the love of her life, her partner, and her best friend. He had been taken so suddenly, leaving her with questions she couldn't answer and a void she couldn't fill. The house that had once been full of life now felt like a prison. The walls, the furniture, even the quiet ticking of the clock seemed to remind her of the life she had lost. Her friends had stopped visiting as often, unsure of what to say to her. Some of them said she needed to move on, that it was time to start living again, but Margaret wasn't ready. How could she? How could she even think about moving forward when the love of her life was gone? It had been a year since Robert's death, and still, Margaret couldn't bring herself to take off the black dresses she wore in mourning. She would wear them every day, even when she was alone. The color seemed to match the emptiness inside her. She didn't want to change. She didn't want to forget him. Every time she thought of moving on, she felt a pang of guilt, like she was betraying his memory. How could she ever love someone else when she had already loved him so completely? Margaret had grown used to the silence. Her days were spent in solitude, her only company the whispers of the past. She spent most of her time in the garden, tending to the flowers Robert had planted for her, watering the plants as if they too were a piece of him. But even the garden couldn't fill the emptiness. Nothing could. Not even the long walks she used to enjoy with Robert, or the times they had spent watching the sunset together, hand in hand. One evening, as the last light of the day faded behind the hills, Margaret heard the sound of a car pulling up in her driveway. It wasn't unusual for someone to stop by occasionally, but this was different. She didn't recognize the truck, and there was something about it that made her heart skip a beat. As the engine cut off, she rose from her chair by the window, her curiosity piqued. When she opened the door, a man stepped out of the truck, dust swirling around his boots as he approached. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a weathered face that seemed to tell 1,000 stories. His eyes, though, were kind, and as he met her gaze, she felt a strange mix of familiarity and uncertainty. He looked like someone from her past, someone she had once known, but it had been so long she wasn't sure. "Margaret?" the man said, his voice low and calm. "It's me, Jack." The name stirred something deep inside her. Jack, she hadn't seen him in years. He had been a friend of Robert's back when they were both younger, before life had taken them in different directions. Jack was a cowboy, rugged and independent, always moving from one place to the next. He had left town a long time ago, and Margaret hadn't heard from him since. She stood there for a moment, unsure of what to say. "Jack," she finally managed, her voice almost a whisper. I didn't expect you." Jack offered a soft smile, but there was sadness in his eyes. "I heard about Robert. I'm sorry for your loss." He paused, as if searching for the right words. "I thought maybe I could stop by, see how you're holding up." Margaret nodded, the knot in her throat tightening. "It's been hard. Really hard." Jack stepped forward, lifting a hand as if to offer comfort, but he stopped himself, respecting her space. "I understand," he said gently. "I've been through it too. Losing someone you love, it changes you." Margaret didn't know how to respond to that. There was a time when she might have turned to Jack for comfort, before life had separated them. But now it felt different. So much time had passed. So much had changed. The two stood in silence for a few moments, the weight of their past and present hanging in the air between them. Finally, Margaret invited him inside, unsure of what to expect. It felt strange having someone in the house who wasn't Robert, but Jack's presence seemed to fill a space she hadn't realized was empty. As Jack sat down at the kitchen table, Margaret offered him a drink, feeling the awkwardness between them. She couldn't help but notice how little they knew each other anymore. They were two people who had once shared a connection but had drifted apart over the years. Now there was something almost fragile about their reunion, something tentative in the air, like they were both testing the waters of something neither of them knew how to navigate. They talked for a while, catching up on the years that had passed. Jack had traveled, moved from town to town, working wherever he could find a job. He spoke of the loneliness he'd felt, the weight of the road always calling him forward. Margaret listened, but her thoughts kept returning to Robert. It was hard to focus on Jack's words when she couldn't stop picturing the life she had lost. Still, there was something comforting about having someone to talk to. Someone who knew what it was like to experience loss. It wasn't the same as having Robert there, of course, but it was something that filled the silence in a way nothing else had in months. When the conversation came to a lull, Jack stood up. "I should probably get going," he said, glancing at the clock. "But I'll be around for a while if you need someone." Margaret nodded, feeling a little sad at the thought of him leaving so soon. "Thank you for stopping by, Jack. It means more than you know." With that, Jack walked to the door, pausing just before he stepped outside. "Take care of yourself, Margaret," he said quietly, and then he was gone. As Margaret closed the door behind him, she stood for a long time, her hand resting on the doorknob. For the first time in a long while, she felt a spark of something that was not sadness, not grief. A sense of connection, a reminder that life continued even when it felt like it had stopped. Maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for healing after all. The evening sun was starting to dip behind the hills when Jack left Margaret's house. She closed the door gently behind him, feeling an unexpected sense of calm wash over her. It wasn't that she was glad he had come, but something about his presence had lifted the weight that had been pressing down on her for so long. She stood in the doorway for a few moments, watching the fading light of the day. The air felt different now, as if the world outside had suddenly opened up to her again. It had been so long since she had let anyone get this close, so long since she had allowed herself to even think about what it might mean to be seen again. Margaret wasn't sure why she had invited Jack in, or why she had let him stay as long as he did. There was something about him, a calmness, a quiet understanding that made her feel safe. He hadn't asked anything of her, hadn't pressured her into talking or opening up more than she was ready to. He had simply been there, and that was something she hadn't realized she needed. The following days were quiet, as they often were, but the memory of Jack's visit lingered in Margaret's mind like a soft echo. She hadn't expected him to come back. It had been years since they had seen each other, and it wasn't as if they had ever been particularly close. Robert had been the one who had known Jack well, but there had always been a quiet bond between Margaret and him. They had shared moments during Robert's birthday parties or gatherings, but they had never really talked about their own lives. Jack had always been the quiet, mysterious cowboy, and Margaret had been the steady, grounded wife. Now with Robert gone, things felt different. As the days went by, Margaret found herself thinking about Jack more and more. She was aware of it, but she couldn't quite help herself. He had become a shadow in her mind, always there, just out of reach. She had tried to keep herself busy with the house and the garden, but her thoughts kept drifting back to him. There was something about the way he had spoken, so gentle, so kind. He hadn't come to fix her grief or erase it. Instead, he had come to acknowledge it, to sit with her in it, and that had made all the difference. Then, one afternoon, she received a call. It was Jack, his voice smooth and warm over the phone. "Hi, Margaret," he said. "I was wondering if I could stop by again sometime. Just for a cup of coffee. I'm passing through, and I thought it might be nice to catch up." Margaret hesitated for only a moment. She hadn't planned on seeing him again so soon, but she found herself saying, "Sure, I'd like that." When Jack arrived later that week, there was no awkwardness between them, no hesitation. It felt as if they had slipped back into an old rhythm, like they had known each other for years. Though in truth they hadn't. He was easy to be around, and she couldn't help but feel grateful for that. They sat down at her kitchen table, each with a mug of hot coffee in hand. There was an ease to their conversation that Margaret hadn't expected. They spoke about small things at first, how the weather had been unusually warm for fall, how the town had changed in the years since Jack had left. But slowly the conversation deepened. Jack asked her about Robert, how she had been coping after his death, and Margaret found herself telling him things she hadn't even admitted to herself. She spoke about the loneliness, about the way the house had felt empty after Robert had gone. But she also spoke about the small victories, how she had started getting out more even if it was just a walk in the garden. She spoke about the grief, yes, but she also spoke about the hope that had begun to flicker deep inside her, a hope she wasn't sure was allowed to grow. Jack listened to her, his eyes never leaving hers. He didn't offer advice and he didn't try to fix anything. He simply listened, and that, more than anything, helped Margaret feel understood. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel so alone. As the conversation continued, she couldn't help but notice the way Jack looked at her. It wasn't pitying or distant. It was something else, something soft. She didn't know exactly what it was, but she felt it in the way he spoke to her, in the way his voice seemed to drop a little lower when they talked about the past. There was a warmth to him that made her feel seen, in a way she hadn't felt in ages. At one point, Jack seemed to hesitate. He took a long sip of his coffee, his gaze drifting out the window for a moment before he spoke again. "I know it's not my place to say this," he started, "but I think you're stronger than you give yourself credit for, Margaret. Grief is a heavy thing. It can weigh you down, make you forget what it's like to feel light again, but you're still here, still standing. That's something." Margaret felt a rush of emotion in her chest at his words. She had never really thought about it that way. She had just been surviving day by day. But hearing Jack say it made her realize that maybe she was doing more than just surviving. Maybe in some small way she was starting to live again. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice catching slightly. "I don't feel strong. I don't feel anything, really. But I appreciate you saying that." There was a brief silence between them, a quiet understanding settling in the air. Margaret could feel the weight of his words hanging between them, and she realized that in a way Jack was giving her permission to heal. He wasn't rushing her, wasn't asking her to forget Robert or pretend the pain wasn't there. He was simply offering her something she hadn't realized she needed: space to breathe, to feel, to move at her own pace. As the afternoon stretched into evening, they talked more, the conversation flowing easily between them. And though the topic of love or relationships didn't come up directly, Margaret began to realize something. She hadn't felt this seen, this understood, in a very long time. And somewhere deep inside her, a small part of her began to wonder if it might be possible to feel this way again, with someone else in a different way. When Jack finally stood to leave, Margaret felt a pang of disappointment. She hadn't wanted the conversation to end, hadn't wanted the day to slip away so quickly. But there was something else she felt too, something she hadn't expected. A sense of comfort, of connection, something she had forgotten existed in the world outside of her grief. "I'll see you around, Margaret," Jack said with a smile, his hand lingering on the doorknob. "Take care of yourself." Margaret nodded, watching him walk down the path to his truck. As he drove away, she stood in the doorway, feeling a strange mix of emotions. There was still so much hurt inside her, still so much she carried from the past, but for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel completely alone in it, and that, she realized, was a step toward something she hadn't thought possible. A future that didn't just belong to the memory of Robert, but to her too. The days seemed to pass quickly after Jack's last visit. Margaret found herself thinking about him more often, something she hadn't expected. He had shown up at a time when she hadn't thought she needed anyone, and yet his presence had brought something out of her that she hadn't realized she had been missing. A sense of connection, a reminder that there was life outside of the grief that had consumed her for so long. It wasn't that she was ready to move on from Robert. Nothing could erase the love she had for him. But Jack's company, his quiet understanding, had become a small but noticeable comfort. He didn't try to replace Robert, didn't ask her to forget him. He simply offered her the space to feel her emotions without judgment, and that made all the difference. One evening, a week after Jack's last visit, he stopped by again. Margaret was surprised when she heard the knock at her door. She hadn't expected him, and yet she couldn't deny the small flutter of excitement that rose in her chest. She had grown accustomed to the silence in her home, and Jack's presence, even in its simplicity, was like a breath of fresh air. When she opened the door, there he was, standing there with a faint smile on his face. He looked as though he had just finished a long day of work, his clothes worn and his boots dusty from the road. But there was something in his eyes, something soft and warm, That made Margaret feel like everything around her had slowed down for a moment. "Hi," Jack said softly, his voice carrying that same calm tone that always seemed to put her at ease. "I was hoping I could steal you away for a little while. I brought dinner this time. Thought we could sit down, talk, maybe take a walk afterward." Margaret smiled, a real smile that felt easy and natural, like it had been a while since she had truly smiled. "That sounds nice," she said, stepping aside to let him in. "I'll set the table." Jack carried the bags of food into the kitchen, and they settled into a familiar routine. As they sat down to eat, the conversation flowed just like it always had, easy, unforced. They talked about small things at first, the weather, the latest news from town, how the crops had been this season, but then slowly, the conversation began to deepen once again. Margaret found herself opening up more than she had intended. She spoke about the long nights when she couldn't sleep, when her thoughts would race back to Robert. She spoke about the emptiness that filled her, how it felt like a part of her was always missing. And yet there was something else she couldn't quite put into words, something that had been slowly building inside her since Jack's first visit. A sense of longing, a feeling that she wasn't quite ready to let go of, but couldn't ignore anymore. Jack listened as he always did, his gaze never wavering from hers. He didn't rush her, didn't try to finish her sentences or tell her that it would all get better. He simply sat there, holding space for her words. Margaret appreciated that. She had never been one to share her feelings so openly, but with Jack it felt safe. He made her feel heard without judgment, without expectation. As they finished their meal, Jack leaned back in his chair and looked at her thoughtfully. No, he said quietly. You don't have to carry all of this by yourself. It's okay to need someone. To lean on someone. Margaret felt a lump form in her throat. She hadn't realized how much she had been holding in until now. She hadn't allowed herself to need anyone. Not since Robert had died. It had felt wrong to want something or someone else, as if doing so would somehow dishonor her husband's memory. But sitting here with Jack, hearing his gentle words, made her wonder if it was possible to open up again. Maybe it wasn't about forgetting Robert, but about learning to live alongside the love she had lost. I don't know if I'm ready for that, she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. I still feel like I'm betraying him just by thinking about moving on. Jack's expression softened and he reached across the table, placing his hand gently over hers. The touch was light, but it sent a jolt of warmth through her. Margaret, there's no rulebook for grief. No right or wrong way to feel. You don't have to force yourself into any timeline. You're allowed to feel however you need to. Her heart began to race at his words. There was something about the way he said them, something kind, something patient that made her feel like she was allowed to feel what she had been hiding for so long. The ache in her chest had always been there, but now it was accompanied by something else, a tiny spark of hope. They finished their meal in comfortable silence, and then, as Jack had suggested, they went for a walk. The evening was cool, and the stars had begun to twinkle in the sky above. As they walked along the dirt path, Jack stayed close, but not too close, just enough so that Margaret could feel his presence, steady and reassuring. They didn't talk much during the walk, but that was okay. Sometimes words weren't necessary. The quiet was enough, the simple act of walking side by side as if they were two people who understood each other without having to speak. Margaret felt herself relax, the tension in her shoulders slowly easing as the weight of the day lifted. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like she was carrying the world on her shoulders. She felt lighter, as if she could breathe again without the constant pressure of grief pulling her down. It wasn't that the pain had disappeared. She knew it would always be a part of her, but something had shifted inside her. She was beginning to believe that maybe there could be room for something else, something new, without forgetting what had come before. As they reached the end of the path, Jack turned to her, his face illuminated by the soft light of the moon. I know this might be hard to hear, but I just want you to know that I'm here for you. Whatever you need, whenever you need it. Margaret's heart skipped a beat. She had never been one to lean on others, to ask for help. But in that moment, she realized that maybe it wasn't a weakness to need someone. It was just part of being human. She wasn't alone in her grief, and she didn't have to carry it all by herself. "Thank you, Jack," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what to say. I'm not sure I'm ready for all of that, but thank you." Jack smiled softly, his eyes full of understanding. "No pressure, Margaret. Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere." The walk back to her house was quieter than the first. Margaret couldn't help but reflect on what Jack had said, on the feelings that were starting to surface inside her. She wasn't sure what the future held, or whether she was ready to open her heart again. But for the first time in a long time, she felt a glimmer of hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, life could be more than the grief she had lived with for so long. When they reached her front door, Jack gave her a gentle hug before turning to leave. "I'll see you soon," he said, his voice warm and steady. Margaret nodded, standing in the doorway as she watched him drive away. She stood there for a long time, her heart full of emotions she couldn't quite name. But for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to feel something other than sadness. Maybe this was the beginning of something new. The following weeks were filled with moments of both comfort and conflict. Margaret found herself slipping into a new routine. Jack continued to visit, bringing with him a quiet sense of peace, and each time they spent together seemed to bring a new layer to their connection. There was a tenderness in his actions, a quiet respect for the grief that still lingered in her heart. And yet, with each passing day, Margaret found herself battling something deeper, something she wasn't sure she was ready to face. Jack had become a constant presence in her life, a friend who had quickly become more than just that. She hadn't expected it. She hadn't expected to feel this way, especially not so soon after Robert's death. Every time she saw Jack, she couldn't help but notice the way he made her feel. Safe, understood, and dare she admit it, even cared for. But there was always a lingering doubt in the back of her mind. Could she really allow herself to feel this way about someone else? Could she let go of the love she had for Robert, even just a little, and give a new love a chance to grow? One afternoon, after a quiet lunch with Jack, Margaret sat in the living room gazing out the window at the sprawling fields beyond. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the land. Jack had just left and she was alone again, but this time she didn't feel the emptiness she had grown so accustomed to. Instead, there was a strange sense of discomfort, a gnawing feeling in her chest that she couldn't shake. She thought about the way Jack had looked at her during their meal, how his eyes seemed to hold a mix of kindness and something more. But every time she felt herself opening up to the idea of something new, a voice in her head reminded her that it wasn't right. She wasn't ready. She couldn't possibly be ready. It was in these moments of quiet that the weight of guilt would settle in. She had loved Robert deeply, and that love wasn't something she could just put aside. She wasn't sure if she even wanted to. Yet Jack's presence had started to fill the void in a way that nothing else had. She could no longer ignore the pull she felt toward him, but she wasn't sure how to navigate the territory between friendship and something more. Was it okay to even consider it? Was she betraying Robert's memory by letting herself feel anything for another man? As the days went by, the conflict inside her grew. She found herself avoiding Jack's calls at times, unable to face him when her heart was in turmoil. She wasn't sure how to explain the turmoil inside her, the way her heart seemed to be at war with itself. She didn't want to hurt Jack, but she also didn't want to hurt herself by moving forward too soon. One evening, Jack showed up at her door just as he always did, but this time, there was something different in the air between them. Margaret opened the door and she could see the concern in his eyes before he even spoke. "Margaret," he said, his voice soft. "Is everything okay? I haven't heard from you in a few days." Margaret hesitated, her mind racing. She could feel the weight of her silence between them. The distance she had created without meaning to. She had been pulling away, unsure of how to explain the mess of emotions that had taken root inside her. And now, standing in front of Jack, she felt it all. Her guilt, her confusion, her fear of moving on. "I've just been thinking," she said quietly, her voice betraying the turmoil inside her. "About everything, about us." Jack looked at her with patience in his eyes as if he knew exactly what she was struggling with. He stepped inside and gently closed the door behind him, his presence steady and calm.
"You don't have to explain it all right now," he said.
"I just want you to know that whatever you're feeling, I'm here." Margaret shook her head, a few tears welling up in her eyes. "I don't know what I'm feeling. Part of me wants to let go, but another part of me feels like I'm betraying Robert even thinking about letting someone else in." Jack took a step closer, his voice low and understanding. "I get it, Margaret. You don't have to let go of Robert to move forward. He'll always be a part of you, but that doesn't mean you have to carry all the weight of that grief forever. It's okay to heal. It's okay to feel something else, even if it feels confusing right now." Margaret swallowed hard, trying to hold back the emotions that threatened to spill over. She had never been good at talking about her feelings, never been one to let her guard down. But something about Jack's words, his gentle reassurance, made her feel safe enough to be vulnerable. "I don't want to lose him," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't want to forget him. And yet, I can't keep living in the past. I don't know how to move forward, Jack." Jack stepped forward, his hand resting on her shoulder. "You're not alone in this, Margaret. And you don't have to have all the answers right now. I'm not going anywhere. Take your time." The warmth of his touch, the sincerity in his voice made Margaret feel something she hadn't felt in so long. Hope. It wasn't that she was ready to completely let go of her past. That would never happen, but maybe, just maybe, it was possible to start living again. Maybe she could learn to embrace the possibility of something new, even if it was scary. Even if it felt like she was betraying a memory she held so dear. For the first time in weeks, Margaret didn't feel alone. Jack had always been patient with her, understanding her need for time and space. But now she felt something else, a sense of gratitude for his presence in her life and a quiet acceptance that healing was a process. She didn't have to rush it, and she didn't have to face it alone. That night after Jack had left, Margaret sat quietly in her living room reflecting on the conversation they'd had. There was still a heavy weight in her heart, but it didn't feel as oppressive as it once had. Jack's words echoed in her mind. "You don't have to let go of Robert to move forward." She wasn't sure how she would navigate the road ahead, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she might be able to find her way. The road to healing was long and uncertain, but at least she didn't have to walk it by herself. The weeks after Jack's visit were quieter, but not in the same heavy way they had been before. Margaret felt a subtle shift inside her, a quiet stirring that she couldn't quite name. It wasn't that the pain of losing Robert had disappeared. She didn't expect it to. But something had begun to change in her heart. The weight she had been carrying for so long didn't feel quite as heavy anymore. There was a space opening up in her life, a space that wasn't filled with sorrow, but with something else, something new, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. Jack continued to be a steady presence in her life. His visits were no longer an occasional event, but a part of her routine. Every time he came by, they spent hours talking, sharing small pieces of their lives with each other. He had become her confidant, someone she could trust, someone who didn't rush her, didn't pressure her to feel something she wasn't ready to feel. Jack simply accepted her just as she was. It wasn't perfect, of course. There were days when the grief would sneak up on her, days when the memories of Robert would come rushing back, overwhelming her. But those days were fewer now. And on those days when the sadness felt too much to bear, Jack was there. He would listen, offer his quiet support, and remind her, without saying much, that it was okay to feel however she needed to feel. It wasn't about forcing herself to move on. It was about allowing herself the space to heal in her own time. One afternoon, as autumn had begun to paint the world around her in shades of gold and red, Margaret found herself standing in the kitchen making tea. The house was quiet, save for the soft rustle of the leaves outside and the gentle hum of the kettle. She hadn't expected Jack to stop by that day, but she found herself thinking about him. It had been a few days since their last conversation, and as much as she tried not to overthink it, she couldn't deny that she was eager to see him again. A part of her had begun to look forward to his visits, to the simple comfort of his company. As if on cue, there was a knock at the door. Margaret's heart skipped a beat, and she felt a smile tug at her lips. She hadn't realized how much she had been hoping for this moment. She opened the door, and there he stood, Jack, with his familiar, easy smile. "I thought I'd stop by for a while," he said, his voice warm, as always. I brought some fresh apples from the farm. Figured you might like to bake something. Margaret chuckled softly, her heart lighter than it had been in a long time. You know me too well, she replied. Come in. Jack stepped inside and Margaret led him to the kitchen. She had learned over the weeks that Jack's quiet, thoughtful nature was what made his company so comforting. It wasn't about grand gestures or elaborate plans. It was about the little things. The way he noticed the small details, the extra blanket she kept by the couch, the way she always took her tea with just a little honey, and how he respected those things, as if they were important pieces of the puzzle of her life. They spent the next few hours together preparing an apple pie. It was a simple afternoon, but it felt like something more. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, it was familiar. Like two people who didn't need to fill every moment with words to understand each other. As they worked together in the kitchen, Margaret found herself smiling more than she had in a long time. She hadn't realized how much she had missed moments like this, simple moments of connection. As the pie baked in the oven, the two of them sat at the table, talking about anything and everything. Jack spoke about his travels, about the places he had seen and the people he had met. Margaret listened, intrigued by his stories, and in turn, she shared little pieces of her own life, the parts she hadn't spoken of in years. They laughed, and in that laughter, Margaret felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. Joy. A true, genuine joy that wasn't clouded by grief or sorrow, but simply by the pleasure of the present moment. When the pie was finally done, they shared it over tea, the warm sweetness filling the air in their hearts. Margaret looked at Jack, seeing him not just as a friend but as something more, someone who had quietly and steadily helped her find her way back to herself. She didn't know when it had happened, but somewhere along the way, Jack had become a part of her life in a way that felt right. She wasn't ready to rush into anything, but she no longer feared the idea of opening her heart to him, even if just a little. I don't think I've ever made a pie this good, Margaret said, smiling as she took a bite. Maybe it's the company. Jack smiled back, his eyes soft with understanding. I think you had a lot to do with it. There was a long pause, and in that moment Margaret realized that she had come to a quiet understanding with herself. She had spent so much time resisting the idea of moving on, afraid that it would mean forgetting Robert, that she hadn't allowed herself to see the possibility of healing. She didn't need to forget her past. But she also didn't need to let her grief define her future. Healing wasn't about erasing the love she had lost. It was about allowing herself the chance to experience new things, to find joy again, and to love again, in her own time. I've been thinking a lot about what you said, Margaret began, her voice steady, about moving forward. I think I'm ready to try. Jack's expression softened and he reached across the table, placing his hand gently over hers. You don't have to rush it, Margaret. I'm not going anywhere. You can take all the time you need. Margaret nodded, feeling a wave of emotion rise in her chest. She wasn't rushing, but for the first time in so long, she was allowing herself to feel something other than sadness. She was letting go of the weight of guilt that had held her back, and she was opening herself up to the possibility of something new. And in that moment, she knew that whatever happened next, she would be okay. She didn't have to have it all figured out. Healing was a process, and she was finally ready to embrace it. The evening stretched on, and the two of them talked more, their words flowing easily, as they always had. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Margaret realized something. She was no longer afraid of the future. She no longer felt trapped by the past. She could carry her memories of Robert with her, and still make space for a future that was hers to shape. When Jack finally left that evening, Margaret stood in the doorway watching him drive away. She felt a sense of peace settle over her, a quiet acceptance that things didn't need to be perfect to be good. She didn't have to have everything figured out. All she needed was the courage to take the next step, and the trust that in time, she would find her way. The door closed softly behind her, and for the first time in a long while, Margaret felt like she was standing at the edge of something new, a future that was hers to create with all the possibilities it held. And that, she realized, was enough.